In this video, we're going to begin developing the quiz engine that I've been alluding to for many of the videos in this series. This will help us put into practice all the things that we learned over the past 10 videos and visualize how all the pieces come together to create a real working application. Now, I want to emphasize that the purpose of the next 4 videos is to demonstrate how to build an application from start to finish, from concept to deploying it on a web server. And I want to start off by talking about the process that we're going to use to develop this application. Then, starting in the next video, we'll begin developing the application, and I'll be taking snapshots of the development process each hour or so to demonstrate how things are coming along. Now, this application will take several hours to build, and most of that process is going to be very boring. So instead, I'm just going to hit the highlights, much like watching the evening news to review the highlights of tonight's baseball game. Okay? So at each point during the development, you'll be able to download the source code, look through it, and while I'm explaining it, you'll be able to see what I've done during that snapshot. Okay, so let's talk about the process we'll use to develop our application. Now, there are a lot of different formal software development processes, and most of them are designed for multiple developers within a corporate setting. One popular process was created for this purpose. It's called the Microsoft Solution Framework, and it outlines the steps that are required to build an application with multiple team members in a corporate environment. And ultimately, the Microsoft Solution Framework, or MSF for short, boils down to some pretty basic steps. First, you envision what you plan to build. Next, you start planning to build it. And third, you start developing the application according to your plan. The fourth step is testing and eradicating any bugs in your application, and then finally deploying your application. Now in the MSF, these 5 steps are repeated several times for a given software development project. Each repeat of these steps is called an iteration. So think of our time together in the next 4 videos as the first iteration in the development of this quiz engine, and perhaps at the end of this series you might want to take on additional iterations to expand the functionality and perhaps make it more stable, improving it based on input from your users. Now in the MSF, there's lots of steps that we're not going to follow, like creating vision documents and formal requirements documents and so on. Since we're really just doing this recreationally, we're not going to really worry about doing all that. Just keep in mind though, if you someday work for a company that employs a process, it's not going to be just as easy as imagining some cool software project and then starting to develop the code. Typically, weeks or even months of envisioning and planning happen before the first line of code is even written. But again, it's just you and I creating this fun little application, so we're not going to worry about all that. Still, we want to be somewhat structured so we have a clear idea of what it is we're going to be building and so on. So let's start with envisioning our solution. As I stated at the outset, we want to build a quiz engine. In other words, we want to build an application that allows users to first register on our website to take one or more quizzes, then allow them to take the quiz, which for now we're just going to limit to multiple choice A, B, C, D style questions. And then the user should be able to review the results and have the results saved so that they can see when they took each of our quizzes and what their results were. Now, additionally, I want to make this skinnable so that other people who might want to use my quiz engine can easily integrate this into their own website by merely changing the style sheet and the graphics and so on. And then finally, I'm going to want to create a very simple quiz entry screen so that I can administer and create new quizzes. Now, I have some other goals in creating this application. For starters, I want to try and utilize as many of the new features in ASP.NET 2.0 as possible. Of course, only when it makes sense to do so. And so you'll see as we begin to develop the application that this might affect some of the design decisions that I make. Also, another goal that I have is that I want to try and write as little code as possible. Now, these may not be realistic goals in the real world. You don't always get uh, to just change the design of your web application to suit the tool set that you have. If you're working for a client or for your company, they may have certain things, want certain things to function in a way that's not always supported in the most direct way by your tool set. So that's a luxury that I have and that you may not when you're working for a client or for somebody else. And also, since we're just doing this recreationally, we don't have to really worry about decisions that may affect the scalability of the application. I'm going to assume that I'm creating this application for a low volume website. Now, I've worked on projects that required a lot of attention to scalability because the client was expecting potentially thousands of concurrent users. So again, this is a luxury that I have that in the real world may not really work. I just wanted to be aware of this. The purpose of our project is just to see many of these ideas that we've discussed in previous 10 lessons come together into one application. And maybe this isn't quite as usable in the real world in a high volume scenario as we could possibly make it, but it'll work for our purposes today. So back to kind of our structure, envisioning the solution involves having a vision. I'd like to build an application that does XYZ. Now at this point, we're not really designing an application. We're just making some mental notes about the things that we'd like to see in our application. And now that I have some mental notes, I'm going to need to solidify these into a more concrete checklist or requirements list. At this point, I'm going to start jotting down some thoughts, maybe on a sheet of paper or a whiteboard. And again, I don't want to get too formal here. I just want to create this for fun. Otherwise, I might go about this differently. But as I begin to jot down some notes, this list of mine includes, first of all, allowing the user to log in, to create a new password, to retrieve their password, to change their password, just the basic membership stuff that we talked about in lesson 9. Next, after the user is able to log in, she should be able to see all of the available tests that she can take. Next, the user should also be able to review the results of the tests that she has taken in the past in some sort of tabular fashion. Now, when the user clicks on a test to take it, she should be basically taken to the test page where she can see the first question and all the possible answers, A, B, C, and D, and she'll pick one of these and then click the next button. Now, you've seen these types of quizzes before, I'll assume. On the final page, she's going to be able to see the results of the quiz in some sort of tabular display, and she'll be able to click on one of the questions in that list and then be able to review the question and the explanation for the correct answer somewhere on that same page. So as I begin to list these things out, notice that we've subtly moved from an envisioning phase to a planning and design phase in our project. And so at this point, I need to start thinking about how I'm going to pull all this off from a technical perspective. And at this point, I'm probably going to start drawing some diagrams to help understand the basic flow between the pages on my site. And this helps me visualize how I want the application to work. I also might draw the layout for each web page so I can see where the data will sit physically on the page. I might make some notes to myself about how I want something to function. And so I call this a low-tech mock-up. Just basically, again, drawing it on a sheet of paper or on a whiteboard. And since this is a web application and I want to look at it to look very attractive, I might ask a friend who's a graphic artist if he'd be willing to create a mock-up of each page for me. Now, I could do this all myself, but really I'm a developer and I don't have the eye for design that my friend Dustin has. So I'm going to explain to him my goals, I'm going to show him my notes, and then we start to hash through the page flow and the layout of each page. And so he's able to come up with some ideas, and at this point, if I were working for a client, I would show them these mock-ups to help them get an idea of what I plan on delivering to them. And this is going to help them see my vision, and it's a lot easier to get their feedback now than once I've finished writing the code. So, but in this case, it's not an issue, right? Because we're just developing this recreationally for ourselves. So let's take a look at what Dustin, my graphic artist friend, has helped me to mock up fairly quickly. So here's kind of a master page that he created so I could click on each of 4 page designs. First of all, we have the login page, and that should be fairly straightforward. We know we're going to use the ASP.NET 2.0 login, so this may not be so applicable, but we may be able to add in some of these design elements like this little line and this head bar and some of the text as well. We'll have to think through that. Then this main menu is really helpful. You can see here that we have um, this little text at the top with the name of the person who's logged in, the option to log out. Again, our little title bar, a list of available tests. That's nice. Also, then the test result history in a table, and we just have like one entry here, but we can see, how many questions and what the percentage correct was and when it was completed and what the name of the test was. So that's really helpful. I think that is something we can accomplish. Then the actual result page, we may want to rework this a little bit. You can see here that we have a kind of a columnar list of the question and whether it was right or wrong. I may want to expand this a little bit, but it gives me something to work with. I can think through some of these things. I may not use the same colored text and things of that nature, but it gives me an idea of what I can accomplish. And then finally here we'll take a look at each test page. And we've already uh, or rather, we're going to talk about some reasons why this may not work from a technical perspective based on some of my particular goals, but it does give me a good idea of the layout that I'm trying to achieve. And I may not be able to copy all these designs exactly, but since I asked him to keep it simple, I think I can get this pretty close. But his work has definitely helped me get a better idea of what it is I'm going to be that I'm going to build, and now starts helping me focus on the technical things I'm going to need to do to make this all happen. So for me, it's back to the drawing board and to continue make some notes and try some things out. And so as I start thinking through the development of this application, I know that all the membership related tasks will be pretty straightforward. Based on all that we talked about in Lesson 9, that part will be a piece of cake. Next, I need to think about how I'm going to display each of the questions and potential answers on the questions.aspx page. Now, I know what I would like to do, but I'm not sure that the ASP.NET 2.0 data controls can support it. What I'd like to do is use the details view control to display the question and each of the 4 potential answers. Now, I know I can data bind those in there. The part that I'm not sure about is whether I can edit the template and insert a series of radio buttons in there as well. So to answer that question in my own mind, what I'll do is pop open Visual Web Developer and create a test project where I can work through some of these ideas. So let's go ahead and take a look at this little test quiz project that I created using C#. And again, I did this just to test some theories and some ideas. This will not be the final project. In fact, I'm going to throw this project away at some point, but I'm going to be able to learn a lot by going through a couple of exercises here to test some theories. Now, in addition to working through some of these examples in a test project, I'm also going to look through a couple books that I have and even go through the help system and maybe some examples online to try and find any examples of what I'm attempting to do. Now, unfortunately, after a couple of hours of searching, I don't think that this idea is going to work, so I'm going to have to move on from there. So I start exploring the idea of binding a radio button list to each question's answers. But again, after doing some testing, it doesn't quite jive with what I had in mind, so I have to move on. I start thinking about controlling all the data access in code rather than trying to data bind everything. And while that might be the approach that I take if I were doing this for uh, a website that was expecting a lot of traffic so I could control how everything works a little bit more precisely, I'm going to resist that urge for now. It would take dozens of lines of code, and I want to accomplish this in as few lines of code as possible since I'm just creating an application for fun. I briefly think about taking the easy way out and using a wizard control like you see here. You see this little test? So I'd use this wizard control to create a series of panels, and basically on each panel, every time I wanted to create a new quiz, I would need to basically go in and add or remove wizard steps. Then on each wizard step, I would need to create new controls, and then each time the user clicked the next or previous button, then we would need to evaluate the values of control strictly through code. So basically, while the navigation would be built for me, a lot of the processing of whether things were correct or not, I'd have to do manually in code for each and every test that I create. So this is something that's not very appealing. It's not a very good idea because if I have 10 tests, I don't want to create 10 different web pages and create a new web page each and every time I create a new test. Some of that stuff should just be data driven, which was my original vision. So while this isn't a good idea, in the process of playing around with this for an hour or so, I got a chance to play around with some controls that I wasn't very familiar with. So in my mind, that was still a productive hour or two spent. So after a lot of soul searching and creating little tests, I settle on a strategy to bind each question and possible answers to a detail view control. So this is basically the little test that I came up with. And essentially, I'd be using a drop-down list box to allow the user to select their answer, whether answer 1, 2, 3, or 4, and then they would click the button to go to the next question. Now, the downside of this is that this is not a standard way to create a test. Most people are going to be more familiar with using the radio buttons down the left-hand side that align to the various questions. And realizing this, as you can see, I briefly started to test the possibility of just placing radio buttons next to where I think the questions and the answers will be rendered by my uh, details view control. Now, the only problem with this approach is if a given answer or the question itself is so long that it wraps down to the next line, that would offset every one of the radio buttons and it wouldn't be quite in the right spot. So for now, I've just decided to just move forward with the drop-down list box where they'll select, 1, 2, 3, or 4, and then click the next button to continue on. And after I get some feedback from some users, and if they just complain that this is unusable, then I might revisit this. But before I sink too much time into really developing the ultimate solution, I'm just going to go ahead and move forward with this first idea that I have. And third, I'm starting to flesh out the details surrounding the data structure. Now, my original thought was that I would store the questions in an XML file, but there were two concerns about that I had. First, the more I began to work with the XML, I realized that it'd be easier to have the quiz and question data in a database so I could easily create a relationship to the quiz results for each user. Now, yes, I could have still made it work, but this is where my own personal biases come in. I'm just a little more comfortable working with databases than XML files at this point in my career, so I opt for the database solution over XML. Now, my second concern for XML was that it would be fairly crackable. In other words, if somebody discovered my XML file's URL, they could potentially just pop it open in another browser, read all the answers while they're answering the quiz. Now, while this little application I'm building is not intended to be testing software for certifications and so on, I still want to be able to lock this down from potential cheaters. So I'm going to stick with the database solution right now. So again, on a sheet of paper, on a whiteboard, I start mocking up my ideas on the design of the database. And I do a lot of scratching out and comparing it to my mock-ups to see if the right data is being saved or retrieved from the database for what I need to display or save back in. Now finally, I need to think about how I'm going to save state between each of the pages, specifically the pages that deal with saving what the current selection of the user is, uh, and then moving on to the next question. So originally I thought about saving each answer into the database in a table called something like user answers. So each time the user clicks the next button, it would save their answer for the current question into the database with their associated username and the current question ID. But after thinking through it a little while, I decided that I really didn't need to store that data. In this first iteration, I'm not going to allow people to review a historical record of their tests. So they're not going to be able to go back and look at the answer to every question that they gave. Also, I don't want to hit the database each and every time somebody answers a question. So I'm trying to be a little more conscientious about the resources for my website. So I consider storing everything in the profile of the user using the profile object. But the more that I researched this, it didn't seem like the appropriate place to store this data. The profile object is meant to store more permanent settings, not temporary test data. So I settled on storing the answers to the test in the session object. Now, in the past, you're discouraged from using the session object too often, even though it really made life a lot easier. And the reason you were discouraged from using the session object was due to memory consumption on the server that was required by the session. Some people would store some pretty big things into the session, and that would take up a lot of the memory of the server and slow down the website as a whole. In fact, at some point in the past with classic ASP, and that refers to the days before .NET came out, the session object became a four-letter word in developer circles. However, when ASP.NET came out, the session was fixed, and we're told that it's even been enhanced in ASP.NET 2.0. So I'm going to trust the ASP.NET 2.0 team and rely on the session object for storing the data, storing the state as I go from one page to the next. Now, it won't really become a problem unless my site becomes incredibly popular, which means I probably would need to revisit this application and test to find a better solution. But again, Session is so easy to use that it's going to wind up saving me a lot of time and saving a lot of lines of code. So that is really the last decision that I needed to make before I can continue on. And I haven't really documented any of these design decisions that I've just been talking about. Again, if I were working with others, especially in a more formal setting, I might want to take a little time here and run these ideas by my coworkers, maybe go through a more formal design process where I'm creating diagrams and things of that nature. However, in this case, some simple notes on a sheet of paper or the whiteboard will work just fine. Okay, so I have what I need to get started. I'm going to start by creating a new project. I'm going to add pages to the project that I need, and then I'm going to make sure that all the membership functionality to log in and create a new user and so on works. And then after that, I'm going to start with the harder tasks. I'll create the database, and then I'm going to hook it up to the questions page and the results page and so on. So now that I've gone through the envisioning phase and the planning phase and designing phase, now I'm going to turn my attention to the development phase. So we'll pick that back up in the next video. Thank you.